Welcome to the final segment of the Dynamic Leadership Development Plans series. Today, we're talking about how to embed development into your culture, not as a form, not as a one-time meeting, but as something that lives in the way you lead and manage every day. Now, let's start with the single idea that's easy to say and hard to live by. Leadership is not a one-size-fits-all. In fact, I remember reading that the highest form of discrimination is treating everyone the same. So that's similar, right? Leadership is not a one-size-fits-all, but most systems pretend that it is. Outdated playbooks and rigid roles often push leaders to act the same regardless of context, charging ahead when they should pause, rallying the team when the energy is flat, or forcing structure when autonomy would serve better. And what's interesting is the closer people are to tripping into fight or flight, the more severe this becomes. And in our current environment, I'm recording this in April of 2025 in the US, there's a lot going on. And that VUCA, the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, can create that feeling that we're out of control. It can lead to some of that fight or flight. Welcome to the final segment of the Dynamic Leadership Development Plan series. Today, we're talking about how to embed development into your culture, not as a form, not as a one-time meeting, but as something that lives in the way that you lead and manage every day. Let's start with the simple idea that's easy to say and hard to live. Leadership is not one size fits all. I recall reading that the highest form of discrimination is treating everyone the same. And it took me some time to think through that, but I get it. And it's very similar to the statement that leadership is not one size fits all. But most systems pretend that it is. Outdated playbooks and rigid roles often push leaders to act the same regardless of context, charging ahead when they should pause, rallying the team when the energy is flat, or forcing structures when autonomy would serve better. This segment offers a clear, flexible tool to help you lead with more intention by reorganizing where you are and by recognizing where you are and responding in a way that supports intrinsic motivation, capability, and growth. And I like to use frameworks because they help when it's the most difficult. It's the most difficult when we're on the verge of fight or flight. And with the VUCA environment that's going on, I'm recording this in April of 2025 in the US, there's so much going on that the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity can rise to that level where we're always on edge. But when we're on edge, we tend to go with survival reactions instead of well thought out plans or going back to our strategy. We react. And those reactions, if the reaction then equals the response, which then equals the action, then we're operating out of the past, out of the associations of what worked in the past, but we're in a new situation now. So that's why I like to use frameworks, and I'll introduce one today to help you with making sure that we're living the development plans. We call it the current situation grid, a 4-box tool built on 2 simple questions. Internally, are we performing or underperforming? Externally, is the environment favorable or challenging? That's it. 2 dimensions, 4 combinations. But it opens the door to smarter, more aligned conversations. This works whether you're looking at an individual, a team, a department, or the entire organization. It gives language to what you might already feel, but may not be saying out loud. Here's why this matters. Let's say a team is hitting their numbers in a favorable market. Great. But it's worth asking, are we building capability or just riding momentum? Or maybe a team is performing well despite tough conditions. Maybe there's turnover, supply chain disruptions, or market shifts. That's not just success, it's resilience. Now that's where multiplier behavior shows up. On the flip side, if results are down in an otherwise favorable environment, It's time to dig deeper. Is the issue focus, clarity, execution? And when both performance and conditions are tough, the answer isn't to push harder. The answer is to realign. Maybe that means redefining success for a season, protecting morale, or introducing metrics that foster learning, not burnout. This is essential to maintaining a growth mindset. It's very easy to slip into a fixed mindset when things seem to stop working, things we relied on. And this is where the survival response can kick in when we least need it. This tool helps you see clearly and choose the next step more intelligently. And here's the key: it's not a scoring system, there are no right boxes. This is a conversation starter, a shared lens. It helps you and your teams acknowledge the internal and external state, to get on the same page, to use a common language, so you can solve the right version of the problem. Remember, the first step of problem solving is clearly define the problem. And as I often like to say, Albert Einstein once said that if he had an hour to solve a problem, he would spend the first 55 minutes talking about and clarifying the problem, and then the last 5 minutes on the solution. Now, that ratio doesn't hold true as the problems get larger and the time allowed is greater, but you get the point. So you define what performance means. It might be revenue, customer experience, project velocity. You define what favorable means. In your world, could be interest rates, demand, hiring, climate, regulatory changes. Now, that's the point. You own the inputs. And this is why dynamic leadership makes it so easy to live in your organization. And I say one of the reasons why dynamic leadership did not or does not get a lot of press, because there's you fill in the blanks, not some university or not some think tank. You're filling in the blanks. Now, this is a tool that adapts to your context, not one that dictates behavior, and is designed to scale. It's fractal, meaning the same conversation structure works at the executive level, in a team meeting, or in a one-on-one. Now, you can apply it to strategy, capability, development, employee coaching, or performance feedback. And underneath it all is self-determination theory, which tells us that people are most motivated when they experience autonomy, the ability to influence their work, competence, the sense of growth and mastery, relatedness, a connection to others and shared goals. When leaders ignore these drivers, especially under stress, we often shift into diminisher behaviors. We try to control when that's needed, when what's needed is support. We tighten our grip when what's needed is trust. But when we lean into multiplier behaviors, we create environments where people can grow through challenge, not fear. That's why this grid matters. It helps you hold two truths at once. We need results and we need people to thrive. As we move forward, we'll look at how to apply this framework in practice. We'll revisit the multiplier versus diminisher mindset, review the feedback model from earlier segments, and connect this framework to personality styles and motivation, because in the end, leadership is about knowing what to do, and in the end, leadership is less about knowing what to do and more about knowing how to think, how to see clearly, and how to respond. You don't need more resources, you need more resourcefulness. And that starts with seeing your current situation, then choosing the next step with clarity. So let's get into it. I'm going to go to the pad and start sketching out the framework. Bear with me a moment. I need to pull something up. Hmm. So what I'm doing here, I just realized that one of the slides is missing. I wanted to share it with you, but I may have to skip it. There we go. Maybe. Yeah, all right. So before I get into the framework, I wanted to bring up the the multipliers and diminisher behavior. This is from the book Multiplies. It's a great book, Susan Weisman, and I recommend it as I recommend reading it along with Good to Great and Great by Choice. It's a book that. So here's my thinking with this. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. These books, Good to Great, Great by Choice, and Multipliers, the first two are by Jim Collins. This one's by Susan Weisman. These books went through deep research because they approached it from a scientific method, which means they had to do the amount of research that justified making the profound stake in the ground statements that they did. So there's always going to be another book written. I remember looking at the amount of leadership books that were written in 1 year, and it was astounding. And how do you get your head wrapped around that? But if you go back to books that follow this much research, and when you consider the VUCA environment that we're in, when you put those things together, you recognize that these books are as good as principles, because we can't adjust for every single hiccup or blip that occurs, especially in an environment like today. So, but if you follow the idea of simple, methodical, and consistency, which is in Great by Choice, you want to make sure that you're following something that you can rely on. You don't want to have to second guess whether or not you're following the right things. And that's where these books, Multiplier, Good to Great, and Great by Choice, comes in. So that's why I wanted to share with you the this as a reminder, the difference between multipliers and diminishers, because it's not part of my slide package. All right, that's it there. Let's see, make sure we got this thing looking right. Right. So the multipliers, they're and again, the book goes deep into this, but she looks at the multiplier versus diminisher through multiple lenses or in different settings. And this is sort of a soundbite out of it. Multipliers, they're talent magnets. They attract great talent. All recruiters are not the same. And, sometimes we outsource things. There's a saying I like to say: make sure we're effective first and then work on being efficient. Too often companies will do something like they'll decide to outsource the recruiting, and they might outsource everything from initial contact all the way to just before selection. I would say that it makes sense to outsource at the beginning of the funnel, but somewhere in the middle, we want to make sure that we're engaged so that we're talking to these people, they're getting a chance to see our model of the world, to hear our vision. This is where we can attract that great talent. The recruiter may not get to that great talent. So that's an important thing. Remember, A lot of your great talent is not out there looking for a new job. They're, I don't want to say hiding, but they're happily working. And it's those people who are engaging with people at hotel conferences. I've heard of leaders who intentionally go out and spend time doing things to meet people so that they can do that recruiting. And this is an important step. So I think you can do both. I think you can have the outsourcing for the top of the funnel, but you can also go out and be talking to people to put them in the funnel as well. They're a liberator. They free people up. And this is that freedom of action. When you give a certain amount of freedom of action, people thrive, and the dopamine and the serotonin kicks in because it's supporting the self-determination theory. But what happens, it runs out. The body, our systems become very efficient. And so once that burst goes, and it's making the person work harder and give more and give their all, but then it gets boring. And so we have to keep upping, but doing it in a way that keeps them thriving, not in a way that gets them demotivated. It's the same thing with how we speak to them, et cetera. They're challenging. They're challengers. They challenge people, but do it in a way that it's within the person's capabilities. And a debate maker it's an art to debate, but debate to uncover truth as opposed to debate to figure out who's right or wrong. I like to approach it from the standpoint, excuse me, I like to approach from the standpoint of, if you and I disagree, then if you disagree with me, then I disagree with me until we figure out which one of us is missing something. And that's a powerful place to come from, because it gets into this conversation and you're giving and taking. And usually out of a good conversation like that, you arrive at one of those 3 + 3 = 9 kind of situations. And then they're an investor. They're investing in people. I still remember when this was FedEx first came out, goes back way back to the 80s, and they were like guaranteeing overnight. And startups are real scrappy, and they're trying to make it happen, and they don't want to miss anything. And in the beginning days, FedEx didn't have all the infrastructure around, and this manager hired a helicopter because there was some problem. I don't remember if it was a truck that broke down or something, but he hired a helicopter to get the packages there. It was like a $10,000 bill. That tells you how long ago it was. And the manager thought he was going to get fired. And the president or the owner, he said, "Why would I fire you? I just made a $10,000 investment in you." And that always stuck with me, because we have to be able to look at mistakes and problems as investments. And there's a slide I'll show you in a few minutes that speaks to that. The bottom part: a multiplier is a leader who amplifies the intelligence, capability, and potential of their team, creating an environment where people thrive, contribute their best, and achieve extraordinary results. That's a very dynamic situation there. This is not okay, let me do it and check that box and know I'm doing it. This is a way of life. This is a way of living. That's why dynamic leadership aligns with it so well. The name dynamic says it all. And then diminishers, they're looking at building their empire. They may be tyrants. I don't have any stress, I give stress, that kind of thing. If I want your answer, if I want your opinion, I'll give it to you. They're know-it-alls. They make the decisions, the micromanager, and they don't realize they're doing it. And sometimes this happens out of a survival response. And I encourage you as leaders and owners to start recognizing survival responses around you as well as your own. And it goes like this. If you're in stasis, if you're in a solid physiological state of being, and you're in a solid mental or cognitive state of being, and you get bad news, you can handle it with grace. But if you're already like on edge and that bad news comes in, it can trip us into fight or flight. And it happens very, very quickly. And it's a survival reaction, because it's life or death. It treats that bad thing as a tiger on the Serengeti. And that means life or death. So even though it's something that's easily solvable, it just needs some attention and time, we go at it like it's life and death, and then everything is just bad. And now we're attacking the person who told us, not because we want to attack them, but because our energy is up, our intensity is up, and it goes at them full force. And they receive it as, wow, they're really mad at me, and all they were the messenger. So you want to recognize that in yourself and others. Now, the interesting part is, once that fight or flight happens, it becomes a neurobiological event. You have the cortisol flowing through, you're prepared to release the adrenaline, and maybe the adrenaline is already coming. it takes time to wind down from that. So you may want to excuse yourself. Hey, look, we're going to have to look at this, but let's come back and take a look at it. Let's meet at 10:30, whatever. That giving yourself that time to pause, do some deep breathing on your own, and then approach it more from a conscious mind standpoint. What I'm saying is this: when you get into fight or flight, what happens next is a survival reaction. And that reaction is based on what's worked in the past. And often what's worked in the past is totally wrong for what we need today. And that's where the attack comes, or the withdrawal, or the screaming, or the control. All of these things are survival reactions. And what you don't want is for your survival reaction to equal your response. And because if it equals the response, it's very likely the response will lead to an action that matches. And that's where you have some problems. So you still have an opportunity to stop it at that response level. And so instead of responding with, here's what we're going to do, the response is, hey, let's get back together and talk about this. Let's get so-and-so and so-and-so in the room. And that gives you a chance to calm down. Trying to get your cortisol, it's like putting toothpaste back in the tube, trying to get your cortisol to wind down once it's already released. So I wanted to just show that. And again, I'll read the bottom. A diminisher is a leader who unintentionally stifles the intelligence and capability of their team, limiting contribution and innovation by hoarding control and creating a restrictive environment. So some managers and leaders live in this state all the time because they're always in fight or flight. So hopefully you'll be able to see some of that as you think about leadership and development in your own organization. All right, so that I wanted to share that with you. And now we're going to go back to the pad. And so this box that we're talking about, this four grid current situation. And the reason this makes sense is because when I first learned about the SWOT analysis decades ago, right? I mean, you do a SWOT analysis and it didn't change. First of all, it was more of a manufacturing environment, less of a technology environment, but the SWOT analysis didn't change very much, right? So a few years later, that SWOT analysis still held, because manufacturing, it tends to move slowly. And, the leaders tended to last for years, sometimes decades, the top people in your industry or in your sector. But now with startups and private equity and buying and selling firms and so much going on, the change can happen quickly. Before you even get the strategy working on all legs, that SWOT analysis can be out of date. So the 4-grid situation is this: we have performing. So how are we doing? Are we doing what we should be? Are our results where they should be? And you pick you choose the metrics. You choose the KPIs. You choose the hierarchy. Like, is growth more than profit? Is profit more important than growth? And then the next one, obviously, we would have underperforming. Now, the metrics, the measures could be the same, but I would introduce a how, right? The conversation we're in is getting your development, your leadership development to live, embedding it into your culture, into how you run your organization. And in the development plans, we talked about the what is the result, and the how is how we get that result, which means how is a part of the conversation. We don't want to be an organization that results by any means necessary, because this is where you get cutting corners. It's where you get shoddy, poor quality, potentially short-term thinking, expediency, and these things don't live well or don't age well when it comes to having people thrive in the organization. So I would regardless of what metrics you put up here, I would definitely put a how, because we don't want to improve the results and miss the importance of the how. And then we have the environment. So this would be internal, and this is external. And we have to consider the environment. Is it favorable? Again, you fill in the blanks, right? If you're selling capital, if it's capital equipment, maybe it's what's going on with the interest rates? What are the competitors doing? What is pricing doing? Is there a new trend coming up? So is it favorable or is it challenging? Now, this is not to say that if it's challenging, we excuse the results. That's not how this goes. I would say that when you look at self-determination theory, relatedness, people want to be seen. And it's important to acknowledge when you're talking about results, it's important to acknowledge that the environment is challenging. You don't want to just gloss over that and launch into talking to the person about where they're deficient. You want to acknowledge it, and then you can pivot the conversation to things along the lines of innovation or getting other people in the boat or trying trial and error or starting some skunk works, maybe getting out there and talking to customers, finding out what's going on. You have to get more information because in challenging environments, there's often opportunities, right? This is a shift. Things are shifting. And the early adopters or the people who get in there early can get the opportunity. This is, the saying that you never let a crisis go unused. It's kind of like that. So we want to know, are we in a favorable environment or a challenging environment? And then what we want to do is, these are the ones we want to watch for. If it's a favorable environment, and the person's underperforming, this is not a good sign. You may have a mismatch here. Maybe they're in the wrong position. Maybe something's going on. You got to find out what's happening. And on the contrary, if you have a challenging situation and a high performer, you likely have somebody who's really leaning into the multiplier type behavior. So this is important. Now, I mentioned this underperforming in a favorable environment. They might have challenges going on internally, but there's something else that could be happening. And this is why I recommend doing 360s. Now, there's formal 360s that are facilitated. That's at one end of the continuum. And then you can have half and half. You can have a formal 360, but you facilitate it in-house. If you have an HR department, they would take a role with that, of course. But you can do a dynamic 360 at any time, and it's called start, stop, continue. In my opinion, this is underrated. So what you do, here's how it works. At the beginning of your checkpoint meeting, or when you're setting up the checkpoint meeting, let them know you're going to, as part of the meeting, you do want to get some ideas about how we can improve things around here. And the connection could be, it's a VUCA environment, right? Volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. Things are changing all the time. We're sure there's some opportunities. Maybe some doors are open that were closed before. Maybe there's some new opportunities. Maybe our capital position makes it possible to take on some things that maybe technology has come up. So there's a lot of context for why to ask the people on the front line or your direct reports for ideas about what you can do uh, to move the ball forward, to move the action forward. So it goes like this: in the context of being a high performing organization, and either me as the leader or the leadership team, what are some things that you think, in your opinion, that we should start doing to move further towards being high performing? And listen, don't defend, just listen, maybe take a note or two, but you want to be watching them. You want to make sure you're listening and hearing and sending signals that this is okay, that you're okay. Yes, you can go down that path. Yes, you can criticize me. It's a safe space. The first time, people will be cautious. If you do this 2 or 3 times, by the third or fourth time, they're just telling you. Why? Because one, there's not a lot of negatives that they have. It's 1 or 2 things. And because they see you actually pay attention to and do something about it, they will share it. And then it just gets better and better. The first time it may be uncomfortable for you, it'll be uncomfortable for them. But the main thing is don't judge, don't evaluate what they're saying, don't defend, just listen and encourage more talking. Tell me more about that. That really, I didn't, yeah, tell me more. Is it this way or is it more that way? Just not judging, not challenging them, but just to get clarity. And then after they've exhausted the start, which is, like I said, it's usually only one thing, and might have to press them. Well, there's got to be something we can do. I mean, maybe throw some suggestions out there based on what you've been hearing. And then the next one is, okay, now I know that sometimes we may be pushing as hard as we can, but there's some things that we're doing that are getting in the way. Maybe some old playbook activities that don't make sense anymore. What are some of the things that me or the leadership team should stop doing? I like doing it just me, but by opening up to the leadership team, it creates a safer space. But you don't want to take yourself off the hot seat. What are some things that we should stop doing that are getting in the way, that are maybe causing some friction or maybe causing some rework, maybe hurting quality? And this is interesting because I've seen organizations layer quality on with checking and testing and checking and testing and correcting, instead of going back to the root cause, right? Root cause. I talk about, at some point, you want to make sure you're draining the swamp, not just fighting alligators. You want to go upstream and deal with the root causes, so you're not always correcting. I've seen organizations that they tear things down and start over again. They're wasting so much resources. They're wasting so much time because their quality model is checking versus prevention. And then the last one is more of a positive, right? That's good. Now, what are some of the things that we should continue doing? So I recommend doing a 360 start, stop, continue. The reason that's important is you might find out that for this person who's underperforming, you are creating the unfavorable or the challenging or unfavorable environment. I would do it for these folks too, because you can always learn something. But isn't it interesting if you find out that you are causing the challenges and you are the reason for their underperformance? You may not be 100% the reason, but if you're in that chain and you're early in the chain, you may want to hold off on what you were going to say. And that does happen. You'll experience that. And that's a good thing. So that's the start, stop, continue grid. Now what I want to do is go to take a look at the slides. So let's do this. All right, so the first thing we want to do is the first thing I want to do is look at remind us when we talked about creating development plans last week, we focused on foundational plans. We didn't deal with gap closing, and gap closing is really all about the assessment. It's not a whole lot you can do. You can pull up assessments online. You can just make an assessment as a leader. We know how to do that. But I want to make the distinction that the foundational plans were the 2-year development plan I talked about, the one you set up in the onboarding meeting and the onboarding process, laying out the leadership processes, the methodologies, et cetera. But in this case, if we're talking about underperforming or, underperforming or addressing a challenging environment, preparing for crisis or what have you, there might be some gap closing work to do. And that's a different kind of a development plan, but I can't tell you what that's going to be, right? This is something that you do with assessment and analysis and using your experience. If you have an HR department, obviously they're going to play an important role there. And then this came up, this slide was from last week, proficiency levels, skill maturity. Let's do this here. Hold on a second. So here we had the proficiency levels, skill maturity and scaling, where and everybody doesn't need to be at mastery, right? Are they completely unaware of it? Well, there's some development. Are they aware but not capable? There's some development. Are they skilled? Are they capable but not skilled? They're able to do it, but they can't do it in a tense environment, or they can't do it in this particular situation, whatever. Maybe a person knows how to sell one-on-one, but they're not doing a good job selling to a group, different things, right? And then the trainer and coach is more dependent upon what your organization needs. Then we talked about the cone of focus, and the cone of focus was the choosing your strategic direction, the vision, the mission, the goals, as you can see there, and where are we going? Where are we heading? And then avoiding or ignoring the opportunities and the threats. That's the VUCA that's always going to be there, of ignoring those things, not completely, but you're aware, but you're not going to adjust to every single thing. That's the deal here, right? If you think about the good to great companies and the great by choice, especially the ones that endured through the financial crisis, they focused on simple, methodical, and consistent. They didn't worry about chasing every single thing. The example of Southwest, they went with all 737s. All their planes were 737s, so they didn't have to worry about which pilots were trained to which flights. They didn't have to worry about is the simulator available? What about parts? All that. It was just one airplane. It made it very easy managing the in and out, all of that, so you get it. And I think every business needs to think through that. And we talked about this cone of focus, that it gets wide, right? So you have to reset and bring it back in every year or so. You're going to come back and revisit and tighten it up a little bit. And then I have down on the bottom operating model and your business model. So you need both of those. The business model may stay the same, right? But as things change rapidly, it's the operating model that changes. You can keep the same. Sometimes the business model has to change, right? I mean, look at Netflix and Blockbuster. The business model changed. But there are times when you can keep the same business model and you just change the operating model to adjust. Then we have this we talked about before, and this is the problem solving capability. So everybody comes to the table with the problem solving capability. The challenge is, under stress, are they actually able to access all of it? And this is where we limit their freedom of action to about 80% of their problem solving capability. That freedom of action, it gives them the autonomy and the authority and judgment and learning for them to grow and have some experience, and some jazz, right? Some kind of experiencing some of the the risk and then the reward that goes with that when you solve it. But when they get above that 80%, we want to make sure they're getting us in the boat. So this involved here is they get you as the leader in the boat with them. Doesn't mean you're going to row the boat. It doesn't mean you're going to guide the boat, but you're letting them know to look out for that thing and watch out for this. And there's a pivot, a risk over here that you may need to pivot around. But more importantly, if things do go off the rails, you're already aware. So it's not a shock to you. You're already prepared and you can handle it. And you have some understanding. It's not throwing you potentially into a fight or flight. And this is just the example I was talking about, good to great and great by choice, how the great by choice companies, the companies that did make the good to great, there were companies that went up, but they dropped back down into the steady state. There are companies that went up fast and dropped back down into the steady state, right? We saw this happen in the .com bubble. You're going to see this happen with artificial intelligence. As everyone's trying to do different things, a few companies will come back into the norm. But then the few, they find the hedgehog concept, the flywheel, the simple, methodical, and consistent, the 20-mile march. That's what this is representing. And I covered these in more depth. So this is the 4th segment. And this is in, I believe it's segment 2. So you can go back and watch that. It's still in my LinkedIn Live area, events section. And then this is a big one. Not all feedback builds performance. So this is the red, blue, and white language. The blue language is what we're after. It's specific, observable, and action-oriented. And it's not just a cool thing to do. It's not just some best practice. This actually taps into dopamine and serotonin. And in probably every series I do, I talk about the neuroscience of it. Why? Because the brain is over 100,000 years old. Some parts of it are a million years old, apparently. But it's going to be there for a while, right? It's not going to change. It's probably not going to change in my lifetime. So understanding how dopamine actually makes us do the things that we do and why serotonin spikes make us take on more and why serotonin dips can throw us into a fixed mindset. Understanding that allows you to navigate unfamiliar situations like you're familiar with it. Why? Because you're dealing with the fear and the greed or the self-interest, I'll call it, right? The fear and the self-interest that's always going on, and you see the patterns and it starts to look the same. So the blue language, by making it observable, action-oriented, and specific, it attaches the feedback to the task and what they were doing or what they did or didn't do, instead of, to me, if I use red language, the good feelings or bad feelings that come out of the feedback, they get attached to the leader. And then it's this thing like, when the leader's around, I'm going to behave, and when they're not around, then I'll not. But when you use blue language, you attach it to the task and it reinforces it, because the dopamine likes to get that hit. And it knows that when it does the right thing, it's going to get a hit. Just like Pavlov's dogs, you ring the bell and they salivate because the bell is associated with the food. And then the white language, this is not what we want to be doing. White language is describing what is not there. And so there's no way you're really going to develop by focusing on what's not there. And then we have the blue language. There's other things. Blue language, there's situation, behavior, and impact, and nonviolent communication. So these are tools that you can use if things get off the rails. But blue language is the core when it comes to feedback, and situation, behavior, impact can be used to enhance it, and nonviolent communication can be used when things go off the rails. So again, you can go back to those early sessions. You can look those both up on the internet and get more information than you'll ever want. You also talked about the 4-style grid. Remember, if you're dealing with a thinker, if you're working with a thinker and they're in a sales position, it's not going to come as naturally to them perhaps as a socializer would, right? The extroverted people are going to naturally do better in sales, but it doesn't mean that thinkers can't do well. It's just going to be different. So you want to be aware of that. And then the other thing that shows up on this slide is that, remember, we talked about, or if you weren't there, the director and the relator, these have natural tension because they don't have the indirect or people-oriented in common. And the thinker and the socializer have natural tension because they don't have the directness, and the people-oriented and common. So the point here is that when you don't have one of the dimensions in common, there's going to be natural stress, and just trying to communicate gets harder. You can also see that happening in Myers-Briggs with the N and the S, the intuitor and the sensor. That's the biggest area of breakdown in business. The N likes the big picture first, the S likes the concrete and detail first. They both can handle each equally, but it's which one they like first. And if you can get to the level or to the point where you're able to be fluid and introduce things like that when you're talking to them, then you'll start to see the power of looking at the leadership and leadership development in the context of how the brain works. Without getting in deep into neuroscience, it's just learning a few things to give you the ability to leverage it. And then we have, so there's a slide. You could take a screenshot of this. I already talked about it. And it adds the multiplier feedback. So there's your blue language, your situation, behavior, impact, and your nonviolent communication explained. And nonviolent communication is something you may want to role play with your senior staff, especially if they're having trouble, or especially if there's like volatile environments, a lot of negative activity going on. Nonviolent communication is a good place to start. So there you go. This is the last of the series. Or what we wanted to do was be able to identify and build development plans, identify the needs for the development plan, and I laid it out for a two-year timeline. Then we talked about developing them. How do you create the plans? And it's basically what your organization needs. But I provided some frameworks and some ways to think about it. But you know what your leaders need for that next level. Don't wait until the promotion is there to develop them. Start developing it early, and you're going to find that you're in much better position. You can also delegate things like dealing with the government agencies, et cetera, or maybe having some people step in and helping marketing or sales to build those skills. And then this one today was about the making it live. And it's really this framework of internal and external looking at it. Sort of like, in a way, it's like the SWOT, where you're looking at strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats. But this is more of a dynamic view, right? The SWOT analysis is a point in time. This one is dynamic. It's always looking at how has it changed. One thing you want to watch out for is changing the strategy or changing the operating model and saying that's the thing we need to fix when you're already deviating from it 50% of the time. If you're already deviating from the operating model 50% of the time, I would say it's probably better to get some control over that deviation before changing the operating model. Otherwise, you're chasing a moving target. So that's it there. We'll come back, take a couple of weeks off from these live events, and then we'll come back and start talking about innovation. And that will most likely be real live interaction, so we can deal with real world situations, bringing that together. So stay tuned. You'll see those showing up on my event section. All right. Take care.